Vaccines are magnificent innovations to the world of medicine. Living without fear of smallpox or measles has a huge impact globally. However, there are some skeptics. Anti-vax is a long-growing movement in which some people are wary or fully reject vaccines. In fact, in 2019, a survey reported 16% of Americans did not believe it was important to get their children vaccinated. Although frustrating, let's not shun these people or bash them. Let us learn to educate each other and find a way to safely live among anti-vaxxers. Because sometimes those anti-vaxxers are our family, our friends, people we look up to. Like Hannah, a relative of mine who preaches anti-vax propaganda. None of her 4 children are vaccinated, and she regularly tries to convince her loved ones why vaccines are bad. Recently, her cousin Amy found out her young son was autistic. Hannah was sure to provide her thoughts on why his autism was caused by his vaccinations. Vulnerable and emotional on the diagnosis, Amy was willing to blame anything, thus refused further vaccinations. Education is important in times like these. If we properly educate ourselves and those around us, we can keep the anti-vaccine movement from growing. So let us start from the beginning, because in order to understand the present, you have to understand the past. The anti-vaccine movement was first acknowledged in the 1850s during some of the first smallpox outbreaks. The vaccine in which people were protesting was different than what we would think of today. The vaccine in question was the scabs off a cow's teat. European milkmaids found that if one was infected with cowpox, they would be immune to smallpox. This is because of a close relationship between cowpox and smallpox viruses, leading to the antibodies in the body to recognize both. In order to prevent further infection, the government required everyone to receive an immunization against smallpox. However, some people were not too keen on getting sick, because in order to be immune to smallpox, you need to get cowpox first, which is like the modern day equivalent of getting the flu. Those who were skeptical were working class citizens who distrusted the government and its healthcare. However, who could blame them? Doctors at the time had a history of bloodletting and prescribing mercury, which killed more patients than it helped. From their perspective, they had every right to be skeptical. This isn't the only instance of an anti-vaccine movement. If we skip a few decades to the 1900s, you'll learn that African Americans and those who today would be described as far left on the political spectrum were deeply opposed to the smallpox vaccination. It's funny to think that people fighting for suffrage and freedom were the same calling vaccines immoral and unholy. Delving deeper, we can almost begin to understand why African Americans were blamed for the smallpox epidemic. Some towns went so far as to quarantine their neighborhoods. This, ironically, made little African Americans get sick, but besides being blamed for the virus, years of mistreatment and segregation made Black communities untrusting of a white government. Fast forward to the year 1998, when Dr. Andrew Wakefield fraudulently claimed that the measles vaccine caused autism. Never mind that he had a sample size of 12, that he paid some kids the equivalent of $5 to sample their blood, that 3 of the supposed 12 kids didn't even have autism, or that he later admitted to having made horrific violations in ethical and accurate research, and having the huge financial motivation to discredit the vaccine. Despite all this, parents of autistic children were desperate to find a reason for a condition that had no good explanation, a condition whose onset coincides with the age at which children are vaccinated. The anti-vaxxer movement was reborn in a modern era, and it has been reborn with a vengeance. History repeats itself once again as the COVID vaccine is released. Political separation and racial aggressions definitely feed into vaccine hesitancy, but social media and the ability to share one's thoughts to millions of people, no matter what kind of education they might have, has majorly impacted the growth of the anti-vax movement. with celebrities such as Kat Von D, Jim Carrey, and Rob Schneider joining the campaign. Despite how dangerous it is to not vaccinate your own children, imagine influencing millions of your fans to do the same. Unfortunately, it only takes a couple of viral posts, no matter how fake, to influence people to not get vaccinated. In fact, a study at UCLA on vaccine hesitancy stated 40% of Latino Americans said they were uncomfortable and definitely will not get the vaccine. And over half of African Americans in the study said the same. Now, this does have to do with government distrust among minority groups, but a big part is also the thousands of fake social media posts discrediting the vaccine. Now, let's look at the future. How do we kindly and effectively change the mind of 21% of American adults? We don't. The best thing we can do is educate ourselves and those who are most vulnerable. For example, parents of children who are not neurotypical, natural health enthusiasts who recognize things that we put in our body are unnatural and reject it. People who struggle to find a place to fit in, leaving them vulnerable to anti-vaxxers who come off as caring. Education and building relationships are key to getting people on the right path to separate facts from fiction, because vaccine hesitancy is a dangerous mindset. However, for those of us in clinical healthcare, there are some ways to help those who are hesitant to vaccinate children. Dr. Sydney McElroy, a general practitioner and podcast host, suggests 3 effective tactics. 1, be empathetic. Understand their emotions and offer guidance. 2, be presumptuous and assume they're getting vaccinated. Make it seem almost natural. And 3, endorse vaccines and endorse their effectiveness. Now, none of these are guaranteed to work, but with families, friends, and physicians all on the same page, we'll all be a step closer to combating vaccine hesitancy. Because yes, history repeats itself, and there will always be people who don't trust vaccination. But if we educate ourselves, our neighbors, our children, we can keep the percent of anti-vaxxers tiny and leave the anti-vaccine movement in the same shallow grave as smallpox.